And we'll go ahead and get started. This is the Building an Autonomous Tomorrow Policy and Technology Panel. And just a reminder to those of you who are streaming us live online that if you have questions, please send those to hashtag Bell South by Southwest, that is SXSW, so that we can incorporate those questions when we get to the Q&A period at the end. And for those of you in the live audience, there's a microphone in the middle. If you have a question, and please be thinking of those when we get towards the end of the panel. We'll have some time for questions from the audience as well. We'll try to mix in the ones from online with those in the room. So, if you've been here during the day, you've had a little bit of an introduction into on-demand mobility. I think we're all excited about the possibilities that that brings. And one of the first questions that always comes up is, when will it be here? And for a lot of people, the assumption is that the technology is the limiting factor, that's what's going to drive when these great capabilities can be in our hands and we can all use them. But that really isn't the pacing factor when you talk to most of the people who are actually involved in developing the vehicles and the system. So when you talk to most people in the middle of it, they'll tell you that the real answer is that policy and regulatory approvals are going to drive the timeline of when we can actually do many of these commercial operations. So our panel today intends to delve into policy. And we have a great group together to talk about it. So next to me is Dietrich, co-founder of Terrafugia. Next down the line is Lisa Ellman. She is the co-executive director of the Commercial Drone Alliance and a partner at Hogan Lovells. And at the end, we have Mike Romanowski, who is the director of the Policy and Innovation Division of the Aircraft Certification Branch of the FAA. And with this group, we're going to plan to discuss several intersections of policy at the local and federal level, intersections between ground and air transportation, and in fact the entire transportation system, intersections of drones, on-demand mobility and traditional aviation, and the intersection of policy and public perception. So I think there's a lot of meat to work on there. And to start with, I would like each of you, if you could, to just give me your perspective. You're each kind of in a unique place in the space. Give me your perspective on the overall opportunity and how and why policy matters for us being able to get this technology-driven opportunity off the ground.
Sure. Well, if I can, by way of introduction, I'd like to go ahead and pull up, I think it's slide 2. So Terrafugia...
Oh, no. Slide 1.
Maybe.
Oh, I guess we didn't count the title slide.
Slide
Sorry.
1.
Yeah.
Slide 1.
So Terrafugia was founded to increase personal mobility through aviation and to have people really in the air on a more regular basis. One of the ways that we're approaching that goal is through an aircraft that we've called TF2, and that's actually a transportation system with a ground vehicle, a passenger or cargo pod, and a flight vehicle that all work together to provide you a very unique door-to-door transportation solution. So within that context, I've been doing a lot of work with regulatory affairs and government relations, and I think my key takeaway from the last several years of being in that space is that everything is very connected. Previously, we've had very siloed ways of looking at just the technology certification or just the airspace operations, but with these new technologies really spanning the entire spectrum of small unmanned aircraft up into urban air mobility and on-demand aircraft, all the way up back into traditional general aviation, we're seeing a lot of intersectionality and ways in which access to airspace, infrastructure and local considerations, airworthiness certification, and how you operate and who operates these vehicles are all very tightly connected. And I think that presents a lot of challenges in terms of we can't just do things the way we've always done them, but it also presents a lot of opportunities to create value for the traveling public and to create a very safe, integrated system overall. So I think that's my key bit, is that there's a lot of opportunity to connect things in ways that they haven't previously been connected.
Great, and we'll definitely come back to that. Lisa.
Great, thank you. Hi everyone, Lisa Ellman. My background is actually from the federal government side, so I come from the policy side. I worked on emerging technologies, including at the Office of Science and Technology Policy at the White House for many years, as well as other agencies within the White House. And my last job within the federal government was back in 2012, 2013, when the federal government was thinking about integrating drones into our national airspace. I was asked to lead UAS integration at DOJ and help lead the White House interagency working group that was tasked with integrating drones into our national airspace. So from inside of government, I got this really unique perspective and saw all of the different policy issues, including, of course, safety, but also security and privacy, and but also saw the huge benefit of commercial drones and emerging aviation technologies and the strong desire to enable them, as well as understanding the policy issues. So, after working on that for a while, I realized I could probably do more from the outside, and so I left to came to Hogan Lovells law firm, where I lead our global UAS practice group. I also work with many UAM, urban air mobility clients, and as well as founded the Commercial Drone Alliance, which includes companies such as Uber and many companies who are focusing on commercial drones are also in the UAM space. If you could pull up the next slide. So I think it's a timeless issue that policy moves a lot more slowly than innovation. And, what I do in my job is really try to bring policymakers and innovators together. I did a TED Talk, I call this Aviation, policy making that promotes innovation. I think this is something that we're still working on, but of course bringing all stakeholders to the table is the first step, and I think that the FAA has done a great job of that, and but there's a lot more that needs to be done. But in addition to the FAA, there's many other stakeholders as well, and if you go to the next slide, just to give you a sense, both on the federal level as well as on the local and state level, we're working all of these issues all the time. Everything on the federal level, economic authority issues and security and noise issues in UTM. And then if you go to the next slide, to the state and local issues, including zoning and privacy and property rights and infrastructure. There's so many different pieces here that all fit together, as Anna described. And so I think there's a lot of room for creativity in a really exciting space. So really excited to talk about that today.
Great, thank you. Mike.
All right. Well, thank you, Michael. Had the frog show up just at the right time.
Just in time.
So first thing I do want to say is it might strike folks as something unexpected, but our current regulatory environment actually enables urban air mobility as it stands today. Now, that framework wasn't written with urban air mobility in mind, but the fundamental is we do have the flexibility in our framework to do the work that we need to do to safely ensure the introduction of that capability. Now, one of the things that we also have to keep in mind is industry's job is they innovate with technology. It's our job as the regulator to innovate in the policy front. And we have had some successes over recent years that we're going to continue to build on. The first was we rewrote the regulations for small airplanes issued those just a year or two ago. Those shifted from a very prescriptive approach to aircraft design and certification to a performance-based framework for aircraft design and certification, which we set the safety expectation at the regulatory level and really free industry to innovate with how they can achieve that safety objective, and working with the industry and the consensus standards community as well in terms of setting forward the right means to achieve that. So we have a framework that allows us to do that, and it allows us to grow as new technologies, new capabilities come online, as we move from software and changes in crew interfaces and how we actually fly these vehicles to electric propulsion systems and the like. It allows an easy way, I'll put easy in quotes, way for the industry and the authorities to work together to safely certify these vehicles. But like both Lisa and Anna pointed out, we really do need to take a holistic approach to the risk associated with the operations of these vehicles. And if you go back one slide, Anna had something very similar in her slides, where we really talk about the aircraft and its safety expectations. We used to set those aside and look at those independently. Then independently we'd look at all the operational aspects of an aircraft in its own silo. And then we would look at the air traffic, airspace integration of those vehicles. in its own silo. What we've moved towards, and it's really showing effectivity, is an integrated look at the risk and the operation, so that we are, in fact, taking that much more holistic view that's enabled by this performance expectation, where we can look at enabling a true walk, run framework for urban mobility as it moves forward, so that we can, in fact, safely introduce this and safely enable that industry to grow within the regulatory framework, and as we continue to develop and morph that framework. The last thing I'll say is, Lisa pointed out the community acceptance as the major issue in the state and local authorities. I mean, the industry, we could certify this, we can certify operations, we can have all the airspace procedures and framework in place, but if it's not accepted by the communities on an environmental, integration point of view, how it fits into the community, how it fits into noise patterns, do people want to see the vehicles flying over their houses or near their houses? And if we don't have that in place as well, we won't be successful. So I think that is a key aspect of this whole equation, is that state and local coordination.
Sure, I think that's very important. I mean, obviously, Bell, as a manufacturer of helicopters and one of the leaders in this on-demand mobility space, we're an operator of helicopters as well, so we deal with community piece of it as well as the aircraft cert, the operational piece. I will say I don't think our experience has been that it's easy, and while we can look at the existing regulations and say, yes, I can see a path, it doesn't look like a straightforward one necessarily, particularly, Mike, when we look at that siloed approach historically of vehicle, then operations, then air traffic management. And there are even some challenges in traditional aviation with those barriers today as things become more integrated. So I think you gave us a start on the next question, which is, what is the current state? And I guess I would ask Lisa and Anna to give your perspectives, same as Mike or different, on the current state of regulations and policy and whether it really enables what we're trying to do or not.
Sure. So I think where we are is we have an opportunity to get our foot in the door, and we have an opportunity to start learning some key lessons. We don't yet have the whole solution figured out, and I think that's actually appropriate for where we are with the rest of the industry. It's still early days, right? We're far enough along that we know that this is going to happen, and we know it's going to happen sooner than we all think, but we still don't have a lot of the details sorted out. So I think staying flexible and being able to deal with unknown unknowns as they come up, both in terms of technology and the broader ecosystem in which these aircraft will be operating, is important. So I do appreciate the sort of customizable approach that the FAA is taking with aircraft manufacturers. I do agree that there is a solution that can be cobbled together from the existing opportunities for special conditions and exemptions and all of the other tools that the FAA has in place. I think there's going to come a time when those have to gel into a more consistent and universal solution. But I do appreciate the reason to hold back a little bit on that. I participated in the Aviation Rulemaking Committee that rewrote Part 23 to provide this performance-based level of certification for general aviation aircraft. And I think that same thought process of what is the safety intent behind the existing rule needs to, and then how do we capture that as opposed to how do we capture a very prescriptive engineering solution that might get you to that safety intent. I think that same thought process needs to be applied to all the other pieces of the puzzle. It needs to be applied to operators, it needs to be applied to airspace, it needs to be applied to all of these other facets. And if we can do that in a constructive and collaborative way, I think we'll end up with a holistic solution that will be durable as we go forward with this. But I agree that we can get started. But similar to when we first started having automobiles in the market, 100 years ago or so, we had there were local jurisdictions that required you as an owner of an automobile to hire someone to walk in front of your car wherever you went because they were terrified of these big car things, right? So that's comical to us today, but it was a way for them to get started. And we may end up having to do something similar for training wheels, and it will chafe and it will be frustrating, but that we won't stay there. We'll move on to something that's a more durable solution.
Great.
Yeah, and I would just add to what Anna said, I agree that these conversations have started. There's a lot of work that's happening, which is fantastic. I think that there are, you know, a lot of open questions out there, and I think a lot of uncertainty for companies in this space in terms of how to actually meet all of the various requirements from the FAA. From an FAA perspective, obviously they're treating this as you know, the FAA is great at regulating manned aircraft and keeping our airspace safe and secure. That's what they're charged with, and Mike and his colleagues do an incredible job at that. There are additional questions. What does it mean to have an automated vehicle, right? What does it mean when there's no human in the loop? And this is something that we're seeing a lot right now in the commercial drone, in the small UAS space, right? There are existing manned aviation regulations that apply to very small aircraft. You know, but there's many of them don't make sense or lead to an absurd result as applied to drones, right? You have to have a manual on board the aircraft. Well, that doesn't make a whole lot of sense, you know, when applied to a very small drone. And so there's just a lot of things out there thinking forward in terms of as we're trying to automate small drones. There's a lot of questions at the FAA about what that looks like, and understood on the industry perspective, absolutely, there's a lot of testing that needs to be done, but we do want to see a path, you know, to move that forward.
Great. Yeah, I think we're all appreciative of the movement at the FAA leadership level in particular. I mean, the fact that there's a policy and innovation directorate that kind of realigns to focus around a recognition that technology is moving very quickly and the FAA needs to move quickly as well is a great start. And you mentioned the rewrite of the small aircraft rules. So I guess one of the things that I'm curious about is, you know, we feel like the system today doesn't necessarily support all of the operations that we're talking about, but there is a lot going on already. So can we talk a little bit about what activities are already going on to try to address some of the known gaps, and then maybe we'll come back and talk about what are the biggest remaining gaps that we need to tackle.
Okay. I think, again, what I'll say builds on what the others have said here too as well. We do have a number of things that we are working from. I mentioned the small airplane rewrite, but Lisa mentioned the unmanned aircraft. There's a lot of activity that we've done to enable commercial unmanned aircraft that we can leverage and learn from as we're going forward. We've now have hundreds of thousands of commercial drones operating in the national airspace on a daily basis, right? That wasn't the case a few years ago, right? And that's been based on a shift starting with this framework of exemptions and special conditions and to moving into parts of regulations that embrace segments of that operation. And we're continuing to expand that with some new rulemakings that are out to continue to see safe growth of that industry. I think there's some parallels in terms of what we're trying to do and some knowledge gain that we can take advantage of. One of those programs is, actually it was a presidential program, the Integrated Pilot Projects, with the FAA to work with 10 state and local tribal groups from around the country on various aspects of advanced beyond line of sight UAS operations, unmanned operations. We are learning a lot in that framework that's going to be we can leverage as we move into urban mobility as well. How to align into the airspace more effectively, even though we're still separating drones out of the airspace a bit. We're also moving past that into touching on the controlled airspace. But how to do that safely, how to recognize the capabilities of the technologies, how to ensure the right traffic management framework and the like. Those same things will be directly applicable to urban mobility. We also have work we're doing with NASA and some of the companies as well. NASA is an Urban Air Mobility Grand Challenge out there. They also have a systems integration operations pilot project that NASA, working with companies, working with the FAA, we're working together on this to learn how to manage some of these integration issues and how to handle that more effectively from that holistic regulatory framework. So what we're trying to do is leverage the testing and discovery that's going on under the NASA program as we solidify what requirements might look like or expectations may look like as we go forward. And it allows us to also get data on things like environmental capabilities. What are we seeing noise levels that would meet community acceptance, and have a strong basis to make determinations on whether or not certain types of operations will work in a community in a way that is somewhat data agnostic. And NASA collects data, and NASA is a very respected federal agency, so we can leverage some of that type of activity. So again, I think there's a lot of things that we're going to continue to build on, but first and foremost, the thing that we're doing is working very closely with the companies that have ideas. We are looking at we see a wide range of concepts right now. One thing that's very true about urban mobility is there's a lot of folks pursuing it, but they're all pursuing it in very different ways. And we see a wide range of concepts that most all of them have a great deal of feasibility to them, and different business models, different targets of where they would like to operate. Again, we can see that as we move forward, this is why having prescriptive rules that say you must design it in a certain way can be detrimental to the growth of that industry. But if we can have a clear performance expectation, what is the safety expectation if you're operating in and around an urban center? What's the safety expectation if you're operating out over a remote region, the desert or forests or what have you? What's the expectation if you have people on board for recreation? What's the expectation if you have people on board who are paying passengers? Those expectations are different in each case, and we have to have a framework that accounts for all of that. So I'll leave it there, Michael.
Okay, great.
Can I just add,
No, absolutely.
just adding one comment, because you asked about kind of given existing laws and rules, how we can be working with the federal government or be in compliance today with urban air mobility. So one thing we've talked about, of course, from the FAA perspective is certification. That's critical. The safety piece is critical. But one thing that a lot of these companies don't think about until later in the process, and it's actually really important to think about right away, is the aviation citizenship requirement, getting the commercial economic authority from Department of Transportation. And this is a requirement in manned aviation. If you're going to be an air carrier, an operator, you're carrying passengers for compensation, for example, you have to actually have economic authority from the Department of Transportation. And the way that the law is actually written, it is very difficult because a lot of these companies come from the tech world. Any company that has venture funding, for example, is going to find it very difficult to comply with these laws. And so this is something that the industry is really all starting to realize, and it's something that Congress is starting to realize, and it's something that DOT and FAA is starting to realize. This is same in the small drone context. Mike mentioned the UAS IPP, the Integration Pilot Program. There's package delivery as part of that, and if you're going to be a small drone package deliverer, you still have to comply with these economic citizenship requirements, and it's become a big issue in that program as well. So just wanted to note that also as something folks should be aware of.
Sure. Anna, do you want to hit that one?
I apologize for the coughing fit up here. Well, I think just that's certainly a key piece of the whole legal and operational landscape, and I think more broadly there's a lot of awareness that entrants into this space need to earn their place at the table in society. So I chair an industry committee focused on eVTOL aircraft within the General Aviation Manufacturers Association, and we're very conscious of things like community acceptance and noise and how to provide real value to the people that we expect will be using these aircraft, and also how to be really good neighbors for the people who may not be using them. So I think that beyond the legal requirements, I think it really is front of mind for at least the more prominent and more responsible players in the space. So it's definitely something that we're considering. Yeah,
so at the beginning, both of you talked about kind of this being a need for connectedness with communities, this being an ecosystem. Let's turn a little bit. We focused quite a bit, I think, on the FAA part, and certainly that's critical, but you're bringing in public acceptance. So Let's talk about the intersection of local and federal and the idea of local policies and how that impacts things. And traditionally, airspace has been federally preempted to the FAA for control, but certainly as you get into low altitude over airspace, cities will have more, a desire for more input, to say the least. Can you guys talk a little bit about how you're seeing that play out, maybe what you envision the future can look like?
Sure. So, okay, I'm happy to take a first stab. So first of all, absolutely, and this is something that we're seeing a ton of action right now in the small UAS context. In the Uniform Law Commission, which is a group that gets together and puts together like model state statutes, is working on this exact problem right now. And it's a great question, right? How much airspace above my backyard do I own? Right? Do you think that you own 200 feet? Do you think you own 300 feet, 400 feet? I don't know, it's something that is an open question. Right now, the FAA would say they have the ability to regulate the blade of grass to the sky, but that's on safety and operations. What about privacy and property rights, which is traditionally regulated at the state and local level? And so there's a ton we're seeing lots of towns and communities and states and localities across the US that are attempting to regulate on privacy and property rights. Some are trying to pick an arbitrary line in the sky. But it's because it's really the Wild West. We don't really know where this is all going to end up, but it's a big question. There's one Supreme Court case that is somewhat on point in an entirely different context, but called U.S. versus Cosby. And this was a 1946 or so case in the World War II context where the military is flying military aircraft very low over a family's lawn and in 83 feet over their home. The family had chicken coops, and that was how they made a living. And every time the military aircraft would fly very low over their home, the aircraft would scare the chickens and kill the chickens. And so the family brought suit against the federal government, a takings case, saying, you are taking my property without compensation because I own that airspace above my home. And the Supreme Court said, in the era of manned aviation, it can't be that you own that airspace. However, there is a reasonableness, and what's in your reasonable control in 83 feet is in your reasonable control, and so they did get damages. There was recently, fast forward to to present day, the Kentucky drone slayer case, where a guy was flying his drone over his neighbor's lawn. He was saying at 200 feet. The neighbor got really upset, saw the drone, shot the drone out of the sky. And the drone owner actually sued the homeowner for shooting his drone and taking his property. And the case ended up being dismissed on jurisdictional grounds, but it raised a lot of open questions that are fascinating, public policy issues that really UAM relies on answering a lot of these questions.
I think there's another facet to all of this too, which is that people tend to be really uptight about their privacy until they're getting a benefit from giving it away.
Right.
And there's pros and cons to that, right? And I'm not suggesting that everything that's going on, talking about big data and Facebook and all of that is a positive, absolutely. But I think it really does speak to the fact that people are willing to exchange some of what's traditionally considered to be your own personal privacy, your own personal information, in exchange for something that brings value to your life that you enjoy. And I think that comes back to a theme that I was touching on earlier, of that it is on this industry, it is on the people that are providing the service to demonstrate that there is real value here. And if there is real value here, then I think a lot of these concerns will be less than if there's not. And I think that really it ups the ante in terms of what as manufacturers the bar that we have to hold ourselves to. And I think there is a lot of interest among the industry to get out ahead of some of these considerations. We're developing loudness standards for us to subscribe to as an industry, regardless of whether or not they become federally mandated, and other pieces of that. So I think if we can really get the value to the consumer that we hope to be able to do with this, that will go a long way towards mitigating some of these concerns as well. But that's a very interesting intersection of sort of preemptive policy and then what the actual value will be. So it'll be I'm very interested to see how this all plays out with some of these communities that may have put in very restrictive requirements in the very early days, whether or not they'll end up regretting that later on.
You know, it's interesting. You mentioned the perception piece, and there's some very interesting noise data out of the UK specific to helicopters, where the same noise levels, same types of operations in London versus Aberdeen have a very different impact, or at least a very different number of complaints. And the difference, the real fundamental difference of those things being that in London it is people flying around, and a lot of people who are complaining don't have the opportunity to. And in Aberdeen, it's a community that's built on oil and gas, and so it's a part of the economy and the nature of the entire community. And so the same actual operation, completely different impact on society because of the perceived benefit. So, Mike, you were...
Yeah, I wanted to add, I think, first off, I don't think we can underestimate the importance of some of these pilot projects that we're doing. The integrated pilot projects for drones, the work we're doing with NASA. And I think, again, because as we're partnering with state, local, tribal entities and industry in these, we're able to break ground and really set some precedents and framework as terms of what really works. And that's incredibly effective, and it brings the ability to take the communities and get them engaged early on and start building that case for acceptance. How do we, it's the pilot projects there, but there are other communities that reach out to us to say, look, we'd like to do certain work in and around, we have certain isolated regions inside our city where we'd like to find ways to do low altitude drone or urban mobility applications. Can we work together on this? And those are very effective, again, because it's giving us real data and real community outreach to build on. And that's how I think we can and will go forward. I think we've learned in manned aviation the importance of working closely with the community. Aircraft noise is a huge issue, right? You mentioned helicopter noise. Jet noise in and around the airport's communities is a huge issue. So my past life, I was responsible for the overhaul of the National Airspace System. As we're modernizing jet routes and all these other sorts of things, very key that we were sitting down with the communities and understanding how were we going to reroute traffic, how are we going to, where their focus areas, are those routes being equitably adjusted based on community perception? Are there ways to route aircraft and think now urban mobility, moving out from the city center to crosstown or more remote areas? Are there routes you can take that minimize flight over people and exposure to noise? Those things are all need to be part of the trade space for an operation. And I think those pilot projects allow us to build and grow that capability.
Great. So, along those lines, I guess, there are some specific cases, the IPP, the NASA System Integration Operationalization Project. Do you see other opportunities for public-private partnerships or public-public-private partnerships when you think about the federal, local, that can help move the ball forward and accelerate our ability to get some of these operations in place or understand what we need to do to be able to do that?
I do, yes. I think we do. And again, I think we're being approached all the time by either it's communities or industry or both to say, look, let's try this out. We have Michael Thacker comes in saying, look, I've got a partner in a certain city that wants to try explore an operation. And we would work out a way to explore that operation. So there's formal large programs like IPP or NASA activities, but there are many more informal partnerships that are formed and worked to enable certain types of things.
So Anna, you mentioned some of the work that's being done at General Aviation Manufacturers Association, the EPIC Committee and the eVTOL under that. Do you see opportunities there as that group, which, I mean, obviously it's a set of industry folks, many of whom are competing, are working together to try to find common ground and find common ground with regulators as well. Are you seeing things coming out of that are going to be helpful or new opportunities to be able to do this public-private partnership to move things forward?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of opportunity there. One of the initiatives that we've been discussing is providing a packet of materials that would be useful for local governments to better understand the issues at play and some of the concerns and some of the opportunities associated with putting a vertiport in their city, for instance. And I think, speaking of the competitive issue, I mean, in some ways, there's a lot of competitive players in the space, but I like to think of an analogy of the NFL, where all of the teams are competitors, but at this point we haven't written the rules of the game. We haven't decided where the stadiums are going to be. We haven't, none of that has happened. So I think there's an awful lot of opportunity for kind of creating the playing field on which we are then going to compete in the future. And I think there's a real acknowledgement that that's a collaborative effort, and that does need to be, there does need to be some partnership within these industry organizations and with the public players and the regulators to make that happen in a constructive way. So I think it's very exciting to see that sort of industry genesis happening at this point, and to see the collaboration and the techniques that are being deployed to bring this to fruition. One of the things that I was going to add to the public-private discussion as well is I've had a number of very interesting conversations with actually state transit authorities. And looking at on-demand aviation and urban air mobility as a way of potentially augmenting their public transit solutions, either getting people to an airport or places that are transit deserts within a city where the population is underserved from a public transportation perspective. So I think there's some very creative thinking happening in that arena as well. There's also, we've also had some very interesting conversations with some of the federal programs like Essential Air Service and things like that. So a lot of exploration at this point, but I think if we think big enough, there's a lot of opportunity for this to have some public good in ways that maybe wouldn't be initially obvious to someone just coming to the space.
Perfect. Lisa?
Yeah, I would also just echo kind of a mix of what Mike and Anna have to say on these public-private partnerships. I mean, I think it is, one of the benefits of this integration pilot program when it was first announced was that it, provided the opportunity for states and localities to essentially bid on the opportunity to have, to put together a team with industry, working with them, to work with the FAA in order to be able to fly beyond visual line of sight or over people, for example. And the big question for states and localities was, what are the benefits of UAS in my community? And I think and it really just shifted a lot of the conversation that was happening in states and localities and just across the country. And so you got a lot of the transportation agencies in the states. All of a sudden, as the conversation started to shift from, I'm really worried about someone spying on me in my backyard to like, well, what benefits could I get from this technology? And will they be helping make my infrastructure more safe, inspect our bridges? How can this help our constituents in our communities? All of a sudden, the conversations really shifted. And I think even, there were 10 initial sites that were chosen. Even, the hundreds who weren't chosen have essentially opted to try to move these plans forward, including a lot of these state Department of Transportation who are trying to think about ways that they can take advantage of this type of technology in their communities. So I absolutely think that there's plenty of room, especially given the lack of data and that we need to do all this testing. I mean, it's like the perfect, it's the perfect setup for public-private partnerships in terms of added value.
So there are certainly a lot of stakeholders involved when you think about all the different communities along with the different agencies. Can you each kind of talk a little bit about how you see the roles of different entities in this solution space? Because obviously, while communities need to have something that's adapted to their specific needs, from an industrial standpoint, we also need a common basis to be able to operate not just within the U.S., but globally as well. And even within the federal government, you mentioned DOT and an economic standard to meet. There's also EPA, the FAA itself,
DHS,
so there are a lot of different roles when you think about cyber, when you think about autonomy, when you think about managing energy storage, when you think about noise and emissions, and then you go to the local piece as well as the aircraft and the airspace. How do you see these roles fitting together? Do you see clear delineations where there clearly is domain of ownership versus this kind of jumble that could be very confusing if we don't find our way through it?
Well, one of my other hats that I wear is very involved in industry consensus standards, and there's one organization in particular, ASTM, that does means of compliance standards for general aviation aircraft, for unmanned aircraft, for a variety of different pieces of general aviation. And I think that's a really good tool that we can bring to bear on this, because all of those different stakeholders that you're talking about, they all have a seat at the table in the generation of those standards. So we have international regulators, we have manufacturers, we have users, we have just general members of the general public that are interested, we have pilots, we have local governments, we have academia. So we really have a very broad cross-section of the stakeholders in the space, and that process gives us an opportunity to all sit down together at a table and figure out what are the requirements that we think are appropriate for this new technology, and that process can happen very quickly. I have personally seen standards being generated in as little as 6 months if you have a really committed group to do that, as opposed to the 7 to 10 years typical for a federal rulemaking project. So that gives us a really powerful tool to capture the collective knowledge of all of these different stakeholders and deploy that in a way that presents those best practices and those recommendations and those requirements for the whole world to be able to benefit from. So it's not the only piece of the solution, but I did want to call that out. It is a very functioning tool in place that we are leveraging to do just that, bring all the stakeholders together.
Great.
Yeah, and I would agree, the standards efforts are critical. You mentioned DOJ, FBI, DHS, and I would also just say, so FAA is obviously doing its thing with safety. FAA is not the only stakeholder, and DOT are not the only stakeholders in the interagency federal government view of UAS and UAM policies. Of course, my old agency was Department of Justice, and from Department of Justice perspective and FBI perspective, they want to know, before enabling broadly any autonomous aviation technology, they want to know, they want a fulsome view, a comprehensive view of who's flying in the airspace and what to do in case of a potential drone or other threat. And so a lot of the UAS rulemakings have been held up for security concerns. There was an Operation Over People rule that was proposed 2 years ago. It was held up because the FBI, working with DOD, DHS, and Department of Energy, all stood up and said, wait a second, we don't want to enable anything flying in the skies until we know who's out there. And so there's a remote ID rulemaking that is being worked on right now, the ability to identify friend from foe, the ability to know who's flying. And I think that will actually help a lot with public perception too. If I'm able to just pull up an app and say, oh, that's license plate number so-and-so, and they have a gold star, they're a trusted operator, it's okay, they're not trying to peer into my bedroom window. Like, that'll help build trust. But on the other side as well, in terms of, that's kind of identifying friend from foe, and then there's this whole counter-drone debate of should entities have the authority to shoot down drones or, shoot down automated vehicles if they potentially pose a threat, right? If they're flying over a mass gathering event when they shouldn't be, if they're flying at airports, like just happened at Gatwick, in Heathrow, and more recently at Newark here in the U.S. This is something, there's several incidents at the Super Bowl. Like, this is something that folks are really focused on, and I think a key piece to really integration of these new aviation technologies into our national airspace. Great.
Mike, I know it's maybe a little awkward being in one of the agencies, but what are your views on who should play what role?
Well, I think within the federal government, clearly the agencies have various roles, and we respect those roles, and we work very closely together to arrive to a common solution. Working with the state, local entities as well, we do have different roles, right? As you mentioned, we manage the airspace. We manage the safety of the vehicle and their operations. But the communities clearly control their land use. They clearly control those aspects of the community. So we have to find the nexus that works for everybody, and with the operators, right? Clearly the operators have to be very closely coupled to the local communities in terms of what they're trying to do and how it works and fits within that community. Is it providing, to Anna's point, providing value to the community or not? We've hit environmental concerns quite heavily today, but those are probably the first and foremost, right? If it doesn't work for the community, the safety perceptions of the community are also key. So we can set an environment that says this operation is safe, this operation, the vehicle is safe, it works within the airspace, but the fundamental is folks are still going to have to accept that, right? That standard is there. Not only for getting on the vehicle, if that's the choice, but this vehicle delivering packages in my neighborhood, is that appropriate or not? So it really is, it's intersections of responsibilities that I'm an eternal optimist when it comes to this stuff, that there are solutions to be had, and we work, as you all have said, working with the full range of the stakeholders, we find those solutions. And as we're doing that, what's happening is, in effect, a standard emerges, sure. a framework emerges, and then we're able to build off of that. If we went and tried to architect it all before it was done, number one, we wouldn't be making the right choices because we wouldn't have the right information to make those choices. But at the same time, if we're able to build on the success, we're able to come up with means that really make it effective for everybody. And then the framework starts to emerge, and that's the beauty of a lot of these pilots and the early work, leveraging what's been happening from the history of manned aviation, but also what's happening on the unmanned aviation side. Because when we're getting into urban mobility, we're really getting to a nexus of those two. Sure. And there's a lot to be learned and leveraged from what we've already done, but also where we're trying to go.
Yeah, and I think an underlying theme that we haven't explicitly stated, policy will follow public perception, right? Mm-hmm. So that's a big piece of the work we need to do. And along those lines, we are getting towards the end of the session. I want to make sure we have an opportunity for some questions and answers. So if you do have a question in the audience, please go to the microphone. And if we have questions online, please let me know, so that we can incorporate those as we're going through as well. So first one from the room. Can you say who you are and, if appropriate, who you represent, and then ask the question?
Sure. My name is Jordan Carson. I work with a helicopter company called Carson Helicopters. So my question today is that there's been a lot of discussion about intra-city travel. So let's say Dallas to another location in Dallas. There's also obviously potential for autonomous vehicles in intercity travel, mm-hmm. Dallas to Austin, Austin to Houston, and so on. How does the regulatory framework look different between those two types of situations, if at all? And if so, how do you see the timelines differing between that type of travel for full acceptance?
Are you, an elaboration, are you talking about manned, passengers on board?
No, obviously you can travel now from Dallas to Austin in a helicopter. I'm talking about autonomous vehicles specifically. Is there a regulatory difference when it comes to intercity and intra-city when it comes to autonomous flight situations?
I think, again, what we're looking to protect generally in the regulatory and operational framework is the passengers on board and the public affected by that. So take two extremes. If we have an autonomous vehicle operating over the desert, that can happen to the level of rigor we would apply to that operational approval wouldn't be as significant as we have ticketed paying passengers flying in and around or between major metropolitan centers, right? Because if you're flying over densely populated areas, you're flying within the densely populated area with a large number of people that have paid, uninvolved public who have paid for that argues for the high safety standard. So what you would see is we view what we call a safety continuum. We look at safety on a scale between those in terms of what the expectation is. So does that answer the question?
Yes.
Thank you.
Okay, thanks.
Hi, my name is Matt Stevenson. I'm with a cybersecurity company called Silence, and I have two kind of disparate questions, and I don't want to hog time. So you want data security, data privacy?
I think we're okay with both.
All right. Neither one of them are gotcha questions. It's more curiosity. Let's go with the data privacy thing. With CCPA coming online in California next year, as far as protecting consumer privacy, we're looking at potentially 50 different state laws regarding data privacy. How much, both from a legislative angle and from a manufacturing angle, does that come into play as you're designing new vehicles? And is it something where you would have to retrofit existing ones? And I'm not talking about scoping out what's going on underneath them. If, depending on what type of drone, what they're doing, if there is user data in there, the potential for them to cross state lines, if that starts to become an issue without a GDPR-style national federal infrastructure. I mean, is that even an issue for you guys right now? Or is that something that you are looking at because it's coming?
I mean, I would say privacy has been a big issue, including data privacy for the industry, but more in a, I think the federal government a few years ago put together a multi-stakeholder process because there's not a whole lot of data on this yet, and it's all just emerging now. There hasn't been a strong appetite to legislate, or I would reframe that. There has been a strong, appetite to legislate by a few on the Hill, but not a general strong appetite to legislate generally on UAS privacy at a federal level. It's given that it's traditionally a state issue. And one big question is, how are drones as a platform for a camera or other technology different from other platforms, right? And should there be new rules and laws applied to them? Now, granted, if there are platform neutral laws and rules that emerge, then they would also apply to drones. I think that would be the expectation, and the industry understands that they would be abiding by whatever those privacy laws and rules are. In the meantime, at a federal level, we have NTIA privacy best practices, which brought privacy advocates together with industry, academia, and states and localities to craft some essentially best practices around privacy, and I would also include some data security protocols in there as well.
Are they treated the same way as autonomous vehicles, like the long-haul trucks that are being developed, or are drones a completely separate classification?
Drones are just a platform for a camera, so they're treated the same as any other device that has a camera on it.
Now you want to do the security one?
Sure.
As you're developing new technologies, these get bigger, we look at different applications for them. What types of steps are you taking and again, both at legislative and at the manufacturing level for cybersecurity to be implemented so you don't get rogue drones or, God forbid we get these swarm of drones because someone has figured out how to, laser hack a drone as it flies by?
Yeah, I actually had a very interesting week a little while ago where I participated in a special forces workshop that was looking at just that. And we did all of this wargaming about these crazy scenarios of the kinds of things you're talking about. And I think there's a lot of energy and excitement around it because it's new and it's not terribly well understood. I personally don't think the actual threat is as high as people tend to make it out to be. There's some pretty simple things that you can do to secure, to secure an aircraft, to secure how that aircraft is controlled, and particularly as we look at bringing automation into particularly manned aviation with a sort of crawl, walk, run approach that Mike mentioned. There's probably going to be a human, if not in the loop, at least on the loop for at least the beginning stages of all of this, and that provides a great backstop and an opportunity for sort of that second. Is this really what we want to be doing? So I think there's some pretty low-tech solutions to some of these kind of high-tech fears right now. But it's definitely something that, we don't want to catch us by surprise as an industry. It's not somewhere where I feel like it's worth spending an exorbitant amount of effort right now.
Yeah, I do think it's a consciousness issue of making sure that we're aware and that we're working with the agencies that have the insight into what the cyber threats are, that we understand those, and then we're architecting our systems to be able to manage that. And there's not one answer because the threat a year from now is going to be different than the threat that's there today. So it's a vigilance. And again, layers of protection. Anna talked about a person in or on the loop for a period of time. There are different ways to architect layers of protection into your system, and I think we all just have to be cognizant of that.
Thanks.
You bet.
Hi, I'm just a person, don't represent anybody. I was curious how much pushback you're getting of this nature. Just as a human being, I am never happy when there's a drone over me. And if a drone is large enough to carry a human, I think that would be quite disruptive and terrifying, to have it flying around. And, I want birds over my head. I don't want to live in Blade Runner world, And you talk about communities and stuff, but with big money in this state, you can go to the legislature and they'll obliterate a community's rules against something like that, So is that the industry's plan to make this happen, even if a community doesn't want it to happen? What kind of pushback are you getting like that, if any, from us Luddites?
So again, I think, particularly for Bell, and I believe this is the case with the rest of the industry as well, our intent is to engage with communities, and the idea really is to make communities better. And so, particularly for the larger vehicles, these aren't going to be flying at 80 feet over your yard. And in most cases, they're not going to be flying over your yard at all. So you can think about the routes that are used for helicopters today about cities. Most of those track over highways, railways, or other easements that are not, most of the time, over people's houses. And so when you start planning out a nodal structure around a city for something like an air taxi service, it would be the same sort of a plan where you're trying to minimize the impact over the city, the altitudes at which you fly, and the noise and noise character of the vehicles is different than a traditional rotorcraft, such that it should blend in with the background noise of the city. So I'm hoping that as an industry and as together both government and business, that we're taking that very seriously, that we need to be good community members. And the only way this works is if we actually make society, mobility, and transportation within the cities better, not worse.
And I would also just add from a small drone perspective, of course, the commercial drone community doesn't want to interfere. Like if there is, the idea is not to bring substantial harm to property owners, right? And so this Uniform Law Commission, which is drafting this draft tort, which would deal with property rights in drones, industry has signed on to a version of that which would enable a violation of the law if you're flying over private property and substantially interfering with that person's use and enjoyment of their land, which is the traditional standard for a nuisance. That's certainly not anybody's, what anybody's trying to do. And I think actually, if a small drone is flying 200 feet in the air, you're not going to hear it for the most part. I mean, they're small. You're not likely going to hear it.
Yeah. So we are coming to the close. I'm going to take back the command for a minute and ask one last question. We started the discussion around policy overall, the integrated nature of policy, the fact that there is a framework, albeit a bit challenging today, to be able to move forward. If you could instantly change one policy, regulation, or other governmental obstacle at the moment to accomplishing the operations that we're trying to do with on-demand mobility, with drones, with personal aviation, what would you change, why, and what do you think would be the impact?
I think, I mentioned this more broadly earlier, but I think if I could snap my fingers and have something shift, it would be taking the rest of this regulatory ecosystem to the place that we've taken the Part 23 requirements. So the industry and FAA did a phenomenal job of evolving those very prescriptive requirements to be safety intent focused and to really try to get at what makes a safe aircraft. And I think if we could do that for all of the other different types of aircraft that are in play, so right now we have that done for small general aviation, fixed wing airplanes. If we could do that for rotorcraft, if we could do that for commercial aircraft, if we could do that for pilot certification, if we could do that for all of these other pieces of the system and get to what is it that actually makes this system safe, as opposed to you will have 3 widgets and the second one will be blue. I think that would be hugely valuable for the industry and would solve a lot of the problems that we're having in trying to categorize new technology and new aircraft into these old types of aircraft.
Great.
Yeah, so I actually think we need a comprehensive remote identification framework as a key threshold issue to enabling broader these automated aviation technologies. We've seen there's been lots of security concerns, but also from an industry perspective, we all kind of agree there need to be some basic rules of the road for everything out there, not just big drones, not just UAM vehicles, not just helicopters and airplanes. And that is something where the federal government feels very strongly on that. I think we'll see limited progress until we have a comprehensive remote identification framework in place. So I know that the FAA is working hard on that, and so thank you, Mike.
Yeah.
So Mike, the regulator's perspective.
Okay. So my wish, I think I would like to have that comprehensive performance-based framework in place, not just for certifying all types of vehicles and having it fully integrated across everything from small recreational vehicles up to the largest transports, but also on the operational side, that we have the piloting performance standards clear. We have the evolution of crew from the highest, most capable of piloting need down to someone who is really in a simplified vehicle operation or a highly autonomous vehicle able to fly in an appropriate manner without much training. I think that there are ways to do that. We've actually talked about projects. We've done some work with NASA and some of the universities to demonstrate some of those simplified vehicle operational concepts that many of the companies are working on. And have that framework in place, backed by a framework of industry consensus standards that give everyone a clear path of how to achieve those. As the regulator, we can lay out ways to achieve those regulations, but in many respects, it's more effective when the industry and all the stakeholders can come together and say, these are the most effective paths, or a consistent path that we can develop to meet those performance expectations, and we accept those as a way to meeting the rules. If we have that framework of the consensus standards in place, that would be a huge enabler, and not only from the safety performance of the system, which obviously as a regulator, that's what we care about, but from the business side, having business certainty. Yeah, the investments being made are investments that can be realized. That gives the framework for continued growth.
Great. Well, we can't wave the magic wand, I think, but we can certainly work together to try to make those things happen. So if you'd join with me, please, and thank our panelists. Great conversation. Thank you very much.